When I pulled into the driveway that cold morning in Michigan, the air felt too still. Frost covered the dead grass, and the trees looked like bones reaching for a sky that had no warmth left in it. My hands shook, even though I kept telling myself there was nothing to fear. It was only my family, only the people who raised me, the people who should still love me. I parked behind a row of shiny cars and sat there for a long time, watching the windows of the house I grew up in. From inside came the soft sound of laughter, the kind that used to belong to me, too. For weeks I had built this day up in my mind. I told myself that Thanksgiving was the time for forgiveness. It had been 3 years since I had seen them. 3 years since everything fell apart. I believed that enough time had passed for wounds to heal, or at least scar over. I imagined walking through that front door and seeing smiles again, maybe even a hesitant hug. I had baked 2 pies, pumpkin and apple, because Mom always said homemade food could fix any distance. The smell filled my car, sweet and heavy, and I held on to that scent like proof that love could still exist in the same house where hate had grown. I remember the sound of my boots on the gravel, each crunch echoing louder than it should. I kept replaying what I would say when I stepped inside. I would tell them I missed them. I would say I was sorry for everything, even though deep down I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. The guilt had lived in me for so long that it felt easier to accept it than to argue with it. I wanted peace more than pride. I thought that was enough reason to try. The door was already unlocked. That small detail made my heart jump like it was an invitation. I pushed it open and was hit by warmth and the smell of roasted turkey and buttered rolls. For a moment, it felt like home. Every memory came back at once. The sound of Dad's football games on TV, the soft music Mom played while setting the table, the clatter of silverware, and my sister's laugh floating from the kitchen. My throat tightened. I almost cried right there. They were all in the dining room, every seat filled, the table glowing under the golden light of the chandelier. There were cousins, aunts, uncles, and my parents sitting at the far end. The room went silent the moment I crossed the threshold. The warmth in the air vanished as if someone had opened a window to let the cold rush in. Every face turned toward me, eyes hard, lips pressed tight. No one said a word. I froze with the pies still in my hands. For a few seconds I thought maybe I had come at the wrong time or there was some surprise planned. But then Dad stood up, his expression unreadable. My mother's eyes followed his. Then my sister rose, then my brother, and then the cousins. One by one, chairs scraped against the floor. The sound was slow and heavy, like a single heartbeat, echoing through the room. They didn't shout or point or tell me to leave. They just left, quietly, in perfect order, like they had rehearsed it. The first to move were my parents, their steps careful and slow. The others followed, forming a silent procession past me, out through the hallway, through the front door. The smell of food followed them for a moment and then disappeared, leaving only the echo of footsteps fading into the cold outside. I stood there alone in the middle of the room, the pies still warm in my shaking hands. My breath came in small, broken gasps. The table was perfect, glasses filled with cider, plates of food untouched, napkins folded like small white flags. It was supposed to be a meal for togetherness, yet I was the only one left to see it. The silence hurt more than any words could. I placed the pies down on the counter and tried to understand what had just happened. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they went outside to talk or needed a moment. I waited. I waited until the ticking clock on the wall grew louder than my heartbeat. No one came back. Through the window, I saw them getting into their cars, faces hidden, movements quick. Engines started. One by one, They drove away until the street was empty again. Something inside me cracked. The weight of years pressed down on me all at once. The shame, the rumors, the endless whispers about what I had done. They never let me explain. They never asked for the truth. Back then, when everything fell apart, they decided who I was, and that version of me became the only one that mattered to them. I had been called the reason for my brother's ruined business, the cause of my father's humiliation, the reason my mother cried in church. But none of it was true, not in the way they said it was. I walked through the house, touching the furniture, the framed photos, the little details of my childhood. Each item felt both familiar and distant, as if I were trespassing in a museum built from a life that used to be mine. The couch had new covers. The photos on the wall showed new grandchildren I had never met. My picture was gone from the family frame that used to hang by the stairs. They had erased me. Outside, the sound of the wind rose again, carrying the faint smell of snow. I stood at the window watching the sky darken over the empty street. Every memory felt heavier in that silence. The longer I stood there, the more I realized what their leaving meant. It wasn't confusion or anger. It was a message, clear and deliberate. They didn't want me there. They wanted me to see that I no longer belonged to them. The truth is, I had expected tension, maybe cold stares or awkward small talk. I thought there might be forgiveness hiding under all that pride. I never imagined full rejection, not like this, not on Thanksgiving. It was supposed to be the day people opened their doors, not slam them shut without a word. I had spent months convincing myself that if I showed up with humility and love, they would finally see me again. Instead, they made sure I understood that forgiveness was not an option. I stood in that silent dining room, surrounded by food no one would eat, and felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks, seemed to mock the emptiness left behind. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came out in short, uneven bursts. The smell of the turkey began to turn heavy, sweet in a way that made my stomach twist. I kept staring at the long table, trying to see some sign of them. Fingerprints on a glass, a chair slightly turned, proof that I had not imagined everything. The food looked untouched, glowing under the light that now felt too bright. I thought about how long it must have taken to prepare all of it. Someone had spent days cooking, decorating, arranging every plate. They had done all that while planning to walk away the moment I arrived. The thought made my chest ache in a way that felt deeper than anger. It was like grief mixed with disbelief. I sat down in one of the empty chairs, the one near the middle where I used to sit as a child. The cushion was cold. My hands touched the edge of a plate, tracing the curve of the porcelain. I could almost see myself as I was years ago, swinging my legs under the table, laughing about nothing. Back then we fought like any family, but there was still love behind it. That love had been real once. I wondered when it had changed, what exact moment had killed it. The truth I kept buried began to crawl up through my thoughts. 3 years ago, everything fell apart because I exposed something that was never meant to be spoken about. My father had been hiding money that belonged to someone else, and I found out by accident. I didn't plan to tell anyone, but when my brother's company started failing and Dad offered him help, I couldn't stay quiet. I told him where the money came from. I thought I was saving him. Instead, I destroyed everything. My father lost his job, my brother lost his business partners, and my mother said I had humiliated them in front of the whole town. They turned me into the villain to protect their pride. Since that day, I had been an outcast. No one answered my calls. Birthdays passed without a word. When my aunt died, no one told me until after the funeral. I had been erased like a mistake they refused to acknowledge. Still, I believed that time could fix things. I thought maybe, after a few years, they would understand that I hadn't acted out of malice. I only wanted to tell the truth. Now, sitting in that silent house, I realized the truth had never mattered to them. What mattered was control, and I had broken it. Thanksgiving had been their chance to show me my place again. They wanted me to feel small, unwanted, and forgotten. By leaving, they didn't just reject me. They punished me in the only way left to them, through silence and shame. I stood up and began clearing the table, even though no one would eat. The motion gave me something to do, something to keep my hands busy. I stacked plates, covered bowls, and wrapped leftovers. The house creaked as I moved, each sound sharper than before. I could feel the weight of their absence pressing against my back. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone standing there, ready to take over, ready to tell me it was all a mistake. But no one came. When I finished, I looked around at the spotless room. Everything was too neat, too perfect. I realized they had planned every detail so I would walk into this exact scene. They wanted the silence to hurt. They wanted the emptiness to speak for them. I almost admired the precision of it. It was cruel, but it was organized, as if cruelty was the only language we had left to share. I walked down the hall to the living room, where the old family photos used to hang. The walls looked bare now. Only a few pictures remained, newer ones, with everyone smiling, everyone except me. In one frame, I noticed a small space where my picture had been removed. The outline was still visible in the dust. I traced it with my finger and felt something sharp twist inside me. I went to the kitchen sink, turned on the faucet, and washed my hands even though they weren't dirty. The warm water stung my skin. It reminded me that I was still real, that I still existed, even if they wished I didn't. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the window panes. A snowflake landed against the glass, then another. Soon it would be a storm. I knew I should leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Part of me wanted to stay until someone came back, until someone cracked under the weight of what they'd done and opened the door again. But the hours passed, and the street stayed empty. The food cooled, the candles burned down, and the house grew darker. I felt like a ghost haunting my own past. Finally, I went upstairs to my old room. It was smaller than I remembered. The walls were painted a different color, but the faint outline of my posters still showed beneath the new paint. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. I realized that I had come looking for forgiveness from people who were never capable of giving it. I had spent years trying to fix something that had been broken long before I ever told the truth. I thought about leaving a note, something simple to prove I had been there, but then I decided against it. They didn't deserve my words. They had already chosen the story they wanted to believe. I picked up my coat, walked back downstairs, and turned off the lights one by one. The last thing I saw before closing the door was the table, still set for a feast no one would ever eat. Outside, the snow had started to fall harder. My car was covered in a thin layer of white. I brushed it off with my sleeve, started the engine, and sat there for a moment before driving away. The windows of the house glowed behind me, soft and golden like a memory trying to hold on. I knew that once I turned the corner, I would never see it again. As I drove through the quiet streets, I realized that this day would define the rest of my life. Their silence had spoken louder than any argument. It told me that there was no home to return to, no forgiveness waiting behind any door. I felt hollow, but beneath that emptiness, something colder was beginning to form, a sense of finality, the first spark of resolve. They had chosen rejection, and I had no choice but to choose myself. By the time I reached the edge of town, the snow was coming down in thick sheets. I pulled over for a moment, wiped the fog from the window, and looked back toward the direction of the house. The lights were gone from sight, swallowed by the storm. It felt like the world itself had erased them, leaving only me and the sound of the wind. That was the moment I understood that my story wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about survival. I had been punished for telling the truth, and they had made sure I never forgot it. But now I would decide what came next. I would decide how much power their silence would have over me. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because I went to that Thanksgiving hoping for peace after revealing a truth that destroyed my family's image, and all I found was a house full of food and the sound of every door closing behind me. The snow thickened as I drove, the road stretching out like a long, quiet confession. The streetlights blurred through the frost on my windshield, and the wipers squeaked with a rhythm that matched the thoughts pounding in my head. Every image of that dining room stayed with me. The stillness, the faces turning away, the food untouched. I kept wondering if I should have left sooner, if showing up had been a mistake. But then a voice inside me whispered that the real mistake was ever believing they deserved forgiveness. As I left the old neighborhood behind, I saw the signs of the town that had once been my whole world. The same grocery store, the same gas station, the same church steeple cutting through the fog. Every place held memories, both gentle and cruel. People here still remembered what happened 3 years ago. They remembered the rumors, not the truth. To them, I was the one who tore the family apart. It didn't matter that my father had stolen from people he called friends, that I had only tried to stop him before it got worse. In their eyes, I had shamed him. I pulled into an empty parking lot by the frozen lake, turned off the car, and sat there watching the snow settle over the ice. The quiet was thick and heavy. I thought about calling someone, maybe an old friend, maybe anyone who would listen, but I stopped myself. No one had stayed after the scandal. Friends had picked sides, and most of them chose the side that threw the bigger parties. It was easier that way. I had learned to live without them, or at least to pretend that I could. The truth was that loneliness had become part of me. It was no longer a sharp pain, but a dull ache that never went away. I had learned how to carry it like an extra limb. Tonight, though, that ache grew sharper again. The rejection had reopened something raw. I rested my head against the steering wheel and tried to remember when I stopped believing that family was forever. Maybe it was the day my mother wouldn't meet my eyes. Maybe it was the day they told the neighbors that I had betrayed them out of jealousy. For 3 years, I told myself that forgiveness was strength. I believed that if I could face them with love, they would see the truth. But love without honesty isn't love at all. It's submission. They wanted me to accept their version of the story, the one where I was the villain and they were the victims. That was the only way they could keep their world in order. I realized then that my return had never been about peace. Deep down, I had come back to see if they were still human enough to look at me and feel something real. I looked out at the lake again. Snow had covered almost everything, leaving only a few dark spots where the ice was thin. It looked peaceful, but I knew how dangerous it was beneath the surface. That was my family, calm on the outside, hollow and breaking underneath. After a while, I turned the car back on and drove toward the edge of town. My childhood home wasn't just a house. It was part of a larger property, one my grandparents had left behind. Years ago, after the scandal, Dad had convinced everyone to sign it over to him, saying he would handle the taxes and upkeep. I knew the truth now, that he had never finished the paperwork. Legally, the property still had my name attached to it. I had ignored it because I didn't want more conflict. But as I drove past those old trees and fences, the realization hit me harder than the cold. The land was still partly mine. That thought sat heavy in my chest. The house they used to shame me was sitting on ground that still belonged to me. They had walked out and left me inside what was legally half mine. The irony stung like frostbite. I began to wonder if that was why I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe this wasn't just about forgiveness anymore. Maybe it was about taking back what they had taken from me. I stopped at a small diner on the highway, the kind that stayed open all night for travelers and truckers. Inside, the lights were too bright, and the smell of coffee hung thick in the air. I sat in a corner booth and ordered nothing, just wrapped my hands around the warm cup the waitress set down without asking. Around me, people talked softly, their voices blending into a low hum. For the first time in hours, I felt invisible again, safe in that anonymity. The thought of going back to the house crossed my mind, not to beg or explain, but to see it one last time. The image of the untouched table wouldn't leave me alone. It felt like unfinished business. I wanted to understand why they chose to humiliate me that way, and maybe, just maybe, I wanted to show them that their silence no longer held power over me. The clock above the counter ticked loudly. Midnight passed. Outside, the snow slowed to a thin, drifting fall. I watched it through the window, and for a long time, I didn't move. Then I reached for my phone and opened an old folder of documents I had kept, copies of the property deed, the emails, the letters from the lawyer I once spoke to. The proof was there. They had used the house as a weapon, but the foundation it stood on was still tied to me. I left a few dollars on the table, walked back out into the cold, and started the car again. The engine rumbled, and the headlights cut through the falling snow. The road back to the house was quiet, empty except for the glow of the streetlights and the sound of the tires crunching on ice. I didn't feel afraid anymore. The sadness was still there, but something colder was beginning to take its place. It wasn't anger exactly, it was clarity. When I reached the end of the long driveway, I stopped and turned off the engine. The house stood in the distance, its windows dark now. The snow covered the porch steps and the roof, softening every edge. It looked peaceful, but I knew better. I knew the kind of secrets that had been hidden behind those walls. I sat there in the dark and thought about how easily they had walked away, leaving everything behind as if I were a ghost they could just forget. But ghosts don't forget. They linger. They watch. And sometimes they reclaim what was taken from them. I sat in the car at the edge of the driveway until the windows fogged over. The silence pressed against the glass like another layer of snow. My breath left small clouds that faded and returned, the rhythm of someone trying to convince themselves they still existed. I could see the faint outline of the porch through the frost, a blur of white and shadow. Every part of me wanted to leave, yet something deeper kept me there. I told myself I only wanted closure, but the truth was that I didn't know how to walk away from the ghosts that built me. I thought about how many winters this house had seen, how many holidays had passed with laughter spilling from those windows. I remembered standing on that same porch as a child, waiting for my cousins to arrive, the smell of cinnamon in the air. Back then, everything felt endless. Time moved slow enough for forgiveness to seem natural. Now, even the memories felt cold. The snow kept falling, soft and patient. I stepped out of the car and let the wind sting my face. Each step toward the house sounded louder than the last. My boots sank deep into the powder, leaving a trail behind me that the wind tried to erase. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My reflection stared back from the dark window pane, and for a moment I didn't recognize the face looking at me. It wasn't the face of the person who left 3 years ago. It was thinner, quieter, older. The kind of face built from too many apologies. The key still fit. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The air inside had cooled since the afternoon, but it still carried the faint smell of food. The table looked just as I had left it. The chairs stood neatly around it, silent witnesses to what had happened. The untouched plates gleamed under the low light from the hallway. I felt a wave of dizziness as the memories tried to settle. I walked to the table and sat in the same chair again. The silence pressed against my ears until I could hear the blood moving in my head. I rested my hands flat on the tablecloth and felt the rough texture of the fabric. It was a small, simple sensation, but it grounded me. I realized how much of my life had been spent chasing the approval of people who never saw me as whole. I thought about my mother's hands, how gentle they used to be when she brushed the hair from my forehead. I thought about my father teaching me to ride a bike, his voice calm and certain. Those memories used to bring warmth, but now they felt like tricks played by time. The people in those memories were gone, replaced by ones who could look at me and see only shame. I tried to find comfort in the idea that at least the younger versions of them had loved me once, but even that felt uncertain. Maybe they had only loved the version of me that never challenged them. The tears came slowly, not sharp but heavy. They rolled down my face and fell onto my hands, leaving small dark spots on the fabric. I didn't bother wiping them away. Crying felt like the only honest thing left to do. I had carried too much restraint for too long, always trying to stay composed, to show them that I was strong. Strength had become a mask I couldn't remove. Sitting there, I finally let it crack. I thought about the years that followed the truth I told. The way neighbors avoided eye contact, the way mail stopped coming, the way silence filled every corner of my life. I had tried to fill that silence with work, with small projects, with anything that gave me purpose. But loneliness has a way of finding you no matter how busy you stay. It creeps in through the cracks and sits beside you at night. It whispers that you are still the one who ruined everything. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The counters were spotless, the dishes clean, the fridge humming quietly. I opened it and saw the food lined up neatly inside. It was strange to see so much abundance after so much emptiness. I picked up one of the pies I had brought earlier and set it on the counter. The crust had cooled, but the smell of cinnamon still lingered. It reminded me of every Thanksgiving before this one, the way laughter used to fill the air, the way my mother would scold us for stealing bites before dinner. The memory hit me hard, knocking the air from my chest. I cut a small slice and sat at the counter to eat it. The taste was sweet, almost too sweet. I realized I had baked it hoping that sweetness could fix something sour, but sugar can't cover rot. The first bite filled my mouth with the weight of everything I had lost. I swallowed slowly and forced myself to finish it. It felt like closing a chapter. When I finished, I looked around the kitchen again. Every object seemed to carry a story. The clock that used to hang crooked, the cupboard that creaked when opened, the window where sunlight used to pour in on Sunday mornings. All of it remained exactly the same, yet completely different. The space no longer belonged to me, and maybe it never really had. I was only visiting the ghost of a life that had already ended. I walked into the living room and sat on the old couch. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and dust. My eyes traced the pattern of the rug, the small tear near the corner where the dog we had years ago once chewed. Little details like that used to make this place feel alive. Now they felt like echoes. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The quiet surrounded me, deep and full, until it almost felt like a voice. It said nothing comforting, just the truth that I had tried to avoid. They were never going to let me back in. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the house settle. The wind outside picked up and the snow tapped gently against the windows. I thought about leaving a message, something to explain what it felt like to stand in that silence, to be the only person left behind. But words would never reach them. They didn't want my truth. They wanted distance. Maybe that was the final gift I could give them, my absence. Still, the grief lingered like smoke after a fire. It filled the corners of my chest and refused to fade. I realized that grief was the last thing connecting us. As long as I still hurt, they still had power over me. That thought scared me more than the loneliness itself. I didn't want them to own even my sadness. So I sat there in the dark and made a quiet promise to myself. I would mourn what was lost, but I would not let it define me. They had turned me into a ghost, but ghosts can learn to disappear on their own terms. I would carry the pain until it became lighter, until it became something I could fold up and put away. The house creaked again, almost like it was breathing. I stood up, took one last look around, and whispered inside my own head that this was the last time I would ever let this place see me cry. When I stepped outside again, the cold bit at my cheeks and filled my lungs with air so sharp it almost felt clean. The sky was a gray sheet stretching forever. The storm had quieted, leaving the world covered in a smooth white silence. Every sound I made, each breath, each crunch of snow, felt like proof that I was still alive after being hollow for so long. I stood on the porch and looked at the house one more time. The windows were blank eyes staring back at me. Inside, the leftovers cooled in their bowls. The candles had burned out, and the air was thick with everything unsaid. I realized I had spent most of my life chasing their approval, as if their acceptance could give me shape. But standing there, I saw how small that need had made me. They had left, and the world had not ended. I was still here. I walked around to the side yard where the old shed stood half buried in snow. It had always been my father's place, full of tools and memories of his control. I pushed the door open and was hit by the smell of metal and dust. The air was cold and still. I ran my hand along the workbench, tracing the marks he had carved into the wood years ago. For the first time, it didn't feel like his space anymore. It felt like a museum for a life that had already finished. In the corner, I found an old box of papers, tax receipts, repair bills, property forms. I remembered that the lawyer who handled the land transfer had mentioned missing signatures. I had never paid attention then, too busy apologizing for telling the truth. Now, looking at those yellowed papers, I felt a strange calm. Every line of ink was proof that they had built their control on something fragile. They had believed they owned everything, but even their foundation was cracked. I sat on the floor of the shed and read through the pages slowly. My breath made small clouds in the cold. Each document was a reminder of how much they had taken, how they had turned love into ownership. But instead of anger, I felt clarity. The grief that had filled me earlier began to change shape. It wasn't vanishing. It was solidifying into something steadier. I folded the papers carefully and placed them in my bag. I wasn't sure what I would do with them yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. What mattered was that for the first time I didn't feel helpless. The power they had held over me all these years was slipping away page by page. I went back inside to warm up. The air had grown colder, but the silence no longer scared me. It felt like peace, or at least the beginning of it. I sat near the window and watched the wind move across the snow. The world outside looked untouched, perfect. I thought about how they had walked out of this house, believing they were punishing me. They wanted me to carry shame forever. But shame only works when you keep it hidden. Once it's seen, it starts to lose its edge. I took out my notebook and began to write. Not for them, not to explain or justify, but to remember. I wrote about the night they left me in the dining room, about the sound of chairs scraping and the sight of their backs as they disappeared. I wrote about the pies, the untouched food, the silence that filled every corner. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. Words were something they couldn't take from me. The pages filled with my handwriting until my hand cramped. I looked at what I had written and realized it wasn't a story about betrayal anymore. It was about endurance. I had survived what they meant to destroy me with. That survival felt like its own quiet revenge. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking each second that I was still standing. I thought about the years ahead. Years without their approval, without their faces at holidays, without their judgment filling every decision. The idea used to terrify me, but now it felt like freedom. There would be no more pretending, no more shrinking to fit their comfort. I stood and walked through the house again, not as a trespasser, but as someone reclaiming their place. My footsteps echoed against the hardwood floors. I touched the walls, the door frames, the small cracks in the paint. I realized how much this place had been built on silence. Every wall had heard arguments smothered. Every room had held secrets. Maybe it was time for those walls to breathe. In the kitchen, I opened the window and let the cold air rush in. The wind carried the smell of snow and pine. It filled the space, sweeping out the stale air left behind by their absence. The curtains fluttered, and for a moment it almost felt like the house exhaled with me. I left the window open and stood there, letting the cold numb my fingers. My reflection in the glass looked different now. The lines of grief were still there, but beneath them was something stronger. I wasn't the same person who had arrived hoping for forgiveness. I was someone who had seen the truth behind every gesture, every smile. The family I lost had never been real in the way I imagined. They had loved an idea of me, not the person I had become. The clock struck 1 a.m. The sound was deep and steady, echoing through the house. I gathered my coat, the papers, and my notebook. Before I turned off the light, I took one last look at the table. The food was cold now, but it no longer hurt to see it. It was just food, and this was just a house. The power it once held over me had faded into something small and harmless. I whispered inside my mind that this was the end of their story in my life. Tomorrow would begin. When I stepped back outside, the snow had stopped. The moon had broken through the clouds, lighting the yard in silver. My footprints from earlier had nearly vanished under the fresh layer, and I realized that erasure could sometimes be a kind of mercy. The wind was calm, the world silent except for the faint groan of trees shifting under ice. I walked to my car and looked back only once. The house stood there, quiet and still, surrounded by white. It didn't feel like a grave anymore. It felt like a chapter closing. I turned the key, started the engine, and watched the exhaust curl into the night like smoke from an old fire finally dying out. I drove without music, only the hum of the tires against the frozen road keeping me company. The night was long and open, the kind of quiet that lets every thought echo. My fingers still felt numb from the cold air of the house, but I didn't mind it. That sting kept me awake. It reminded me I was still moving forward. The highway stretched ahead like a thin gray ribbon between fields of snow, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost on it. I stopped at a small rest area, halfway between the town and the motel I had rented for the weekend. The building looked half asleep under the flickering lights. Inside, a vending machine buzzed, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. I sat on one of the plastic benches and opened my notebook again. The words I had written earlier stared back at me. They no longer looked like pain. They looked like a plan waiting to form. I pulled out the papers from the shed, the old property forms, the tax receipts, the repair invoices. They were fragile, some crumbling at the edges, but they were real. They were proof of everything my family had kept hidden. The missing signatures and false dates whispered stories of greed and fear. I didn't need anyone to tell me what it meant. I could see the truth lined up neatly in faded ink. I traced my finger over the oldest page. It was dated the year my father had promised he would take care of things. I remembered how he had stood in the doorway back then, calm and certain, telling everyone that he had done the right thing for the family. But the papers said otherwise. He had transferred property rights without consent, covering it up as if I would never look. I realized that my mistake had been believing I could ever earn their honesty. They had never wanted truth. They wanted control. The snow outside thickened into a soft blur beyond the glass. I sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the heater and the sound of wind. The anger that once came like a storm was gone. In its place was a kind of stillness that scared me with how steady it felt. I didn't want revenge just to hurt them. I wanted balance. I wanted the truth to stop living in the dark. I began to map things out in my notebook, every name, every date, every piece of land they had claimed. I wrote until my hand ached, drawing arrows and notes. By the time the coffee machine clicked off, I had a rough picture of what I needed to do. It wasn't about shouting or breaking things. It was about using what they left behind when they walked out. That silence, that space, that proof. I folded the pages neatly and slipped them into the back of my bag. I looked at the clock above the vending machine. It was nearly 3 a.m. I felt no urge to sleep. My mind was sharp, the kind of clear that comes only after you've burned through every layer of grief. It wasn't adrenaline, it was resolve. Outside, the wind had died down. The snow on the ground glowed faintly under the streetlights, untouched and clean. I stepped into it, leaving a trail of footprints that looked deliberate, one after another. I thought about how easy it was for them to leave, how unified they had been in their rejection. But unity doesn't make righteousness. It just makes noise louder. I wanted my quiet to mean something different, to turn silence into proof that I could stand alone without collapsing. Back in the car, I turned on the heater and rested my forehead on the steering wheel. I pictured their faces when they saw me walk into the house that night. The shock, the discomfort, the careful way they avoided meeting my eyes. They had planned that reaction. It wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed, orchestrated cruelty meant to remind me of my place, but they hadn't expected me to stay. They hadn't expected me to walk through the empty rooms and pick up the pieces they left behind. Their absence had given me space to think. For years, they had been the walls of my life, limiting what I could say, what I could believe about myself. Now that they were gone, I could see past those walls. What I saw was wide and unfamiliar, but it was mine. As I drove again, I began to remember the smaller moments that had built this rift, how I had told the truth years ago about something that everyone wanted buried, how they had called it betrayal when it was really survival. I had carried that guilt like a scar I couldn't hide. Now, sitting in the quiet car, I touched that scar in my mind and realized it didn't hurt anymore. It was just part of me. When I reached the motel, the parking lot was empty. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its light flickering over the wet asphalt. I checked in, dropped my bag on the bed, and sat by the small window overlooking the snow. My breath fogged the glass as I stared outside. Somewhere beyond that darkness was the house, still standing, still full of the echoes they had left. I knew I would have to go back one more time, not to beg, but to finish what had begun the moment they walked out. I lay on the bed, the notebook beside me. The pages rustled softly when I turned them. I could see the plan taking shape in my head, like the outline of a path through the snow. It wouldn't be loud or angry. It would be patient, deliberate, and exact. For once, I wouldn't act out of desperation. I would act out of choice. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was light and dreamless. I woke before sunrise to a pale orange light seeping through the curtains. The air felt different, cleaner somehow. I sat up and watched the world outside turning from gray to gold. Every new color felt like permission. I got dressed, packed my things, and looked at myself in the small mirror by the door. My eyes looked tired but steady. The person staring back at me wasn't the one who had arrived at that house full of hope. This version of me carried something sharper, a quiet certainty that couldn't be taken away. I didn't need their forgiveness anymore. I didn't even need their understanding. What I needed was to finish what I started. As I locked the motel door behind me, the cold air wrapped around me like a warning and a promise at once. The day stretched ahead, wide and waiting. I was ready to step into it, one deliberate breath at a time. I drove back to the house that afternoon with a feeling I had not known I could hold, a steady, quiet readiness. The sky was low and white, and each thin tree stood like a single thought. I parked where the driveway bent, far enough that the house felt small and not overpowering. I sat in the car and watched it for a long time, like someone reading a book they had already finished, but wanted to look at again to be sure they understood the end. I had thought about leaving the papers in a lawyer's drawer and letting time do the rest. I had imagined fading away, building a life that did not bend toward them. But the more I sat with the truth in my hands, the more I saw that silence would only let the wounds fester. Their choice to make my shame public had been a deliberate cut. I could either keep bleeding or choose a way to stop it. That was the fork I faced now. I walked up the path slowly. Snow clung to my boots. The porch steps were cold under my palms. The door opened with the same small creak I had known for years. Inside the house smelled faintly of dust and old spices. The table still held the plates I had packed away, wrapped in foil, unused. I set my bag down by the sink and breathed deep, filling my lungs with the chill and the weight of everything I had decided to do. My plan was not wild. It did not involve scenes or loud confrontations. It used the one thing they had tried to bury: proof. The papers from the shed, the receipts, the old deed copies. They were not just scraps. They showed a pattern of choices that had hurt others and then been hidden behind family loyalty. I would not make accusations in the street. I would not trick anyone or break into locked rooms. I would act where the law and truth met, where words on paper could not be argued away by pride and gossip. I spent the afternoon calling people I could trust. I spoke to a lawyer, not to hatch a plot, but to ask how to let the truth be known without becoming the villain in some new story. The lawyer listened and did not laugh or look away. That alone felt like a small return of the dignity I had lost. Legal words are blunt tools, but they are honest. They give shape to facts without the thin sugar of rumor. I signed forms I barely read, not because I did not care, but because the long, careful sentences were a way to move forward without spectacle. I also reached out to one of the people who had been most hurt by the lies my father had spread. I could have shouted the facts from the rooftops, but facts delivered to wounded hands have more weight. There was sadness on the other end of that call, and then a strange kind of relief. Sometimes truth is not a thunderbolt. It is a quiet door opening. Back in the house, I sat at the table and made a simple list. I wrote what I had, who it affected, and what I wanted to see happen. I wanted to correct the harm. I wanted them to answer for what they had done. I wanted to close the chapter where my name was used as a shield for things that were theirs to own. The paper beneath my pen felt steady. My hand did not shake. I knew my actions would hurt them. That knowledge did not thrill me. It only made me more careful. The point was not to punish for punishment's sake. The point was to reclaim some balance and to make sure no one else suffered the hidden harms while I stood quiet. I would use the house and the proof I had found as the place where the truth could no longer be hidden. It was a cold decision, but it was honest. I arranged for an attorney to send papers the next morning. Those papers would begin processes that could unroll into public records. They would not be gossip. They would be official. I also made a call to a small local reporter who had once known my family in better days. I did not want a tabloid show. I wanted a clear account that could be checked, one that would not be smeared and retold as drama. I wanted facts to live where facts belonged. There were practical details, too, that did not feel violent. I ensured the house itself was secure in a way that matched the legal steps I was taking. I changed electronic access, tied to accounts that had been misused, and updated contact points so that official notices would no longer trail only to the mouths of those who had lied. I put locks on cupboards holding records and made lists of who needed to be notified if a legal process started. None of it required showing force. It required steady hands and proof that I would not let the past be rewritten. I stood in the middle of the empty living room late that night and thought about the faces that had left me at the table. The memory of their exit was a blade still, but it no longer pinned me to the floor. I felt something colder than anger and softer than relief, a sheer clarity that the rest of my life would be built on my choices, not on their judgment. I had decided to act, but I would do it with restraint. Now this is where I did what I wanted you to see and advise on. I hired a lawyer to file the documents that would show the record of transactions and decisions made in the name of our family. I made sure the house I grew up in could no longer be used as a hiding place for the things they had done. I arranged for papers and proof to be sent to both an official agency and to a reporter who could hold a clear mirror to the truth. I closed the digital doors that let private accounts be used as a cover and gave key documents to people who could make them matter without turning them into spectacle. I want you to tell me in the comments if I was right or wrong for doing this, because at that moment, I sealed more than a legal file. I sealed the door on the life I once begged to rejoin. After I finished the calls and the forms, I walked through the house one more time. I touched the old banister where my small hands had once held on. I opened the cupboard where my mother kept china and left a note inside, not to scold, but to explain in a sentence that might one day be read. I turned off the lights and locked the doors. The locks clicked like the end of a chapter. I knew they would notice soon, and I listened for that feeling that used to rush me when their judgments arrived. It did not come. Instead, there was a deep, slow steadiness. I left the house with the snow pressing soft under my feet. The air felt clean and sharp. The weight I had carried for years had not disappeared, but it had a new shape. It was not a burden I had to bend under. It was something I could set down. When I drove away that night, the road seemed less like a ribbon and more like a path. I had moved from grief to action, not to hurt, but to make right what could be made right. I did not know if they would ever forgive me. I did not know if the truth would heal the broken pieces. What I knew was that I had stopped letting silence be the weapon they used. I had chosen to speak where it mattered, and to do so in a way that would not make me into the kind of person I had once feared. The next few days were slow. Papers moved through offices. Voices spoke in neat, official ways in rooms I would never enter. People who had been harmed had a place to stand again, and I kept my distance from loud victory. I had not wanted any of this to become theater. I wanted only to change what could be changed. The world turned under the weight of the winter sky, and I learned how to breathe differently inside it. The first sign that they had discovered what I had done came in the form of silence breaking. For weeks, nothing. I had lived inside a quiet that almost felt sacred. The air had shifted. The roads seemed longer, the mornings cleaner. I worked, I ate, I slept, and sometimes I dreamed of nothing at all. But then one evening, as I sat by the small window of my apartment, I heard the vibration of my phone again and again. It was like a pulse coming from a world I had already buried. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The calls came from numbers I knew too well. Cousins, aunts, old friends who had once vanished the moment I became inconvenient. They were all finding their voices again. I watched the screen light up and go dark. Over and over. The names rolled through the call log like a list of ghosts trying to return to life. I let each call die unanswered. The silence that followed each ring felt stronger than any word I could say. Then the messages came. Not words of apology, not understanding, just panic. They had found out that the house, the land, the accounts were no longer sealed behind their control. The truth was out. The papers I had set in motion had started to move through official channels, and the story that they had buried for years had begun to surface. Their empire of denial had cracks now, and through those cracks, light was leaking. I went for a walk that night. The city around me buzzed with traffic and neon lights, but I felt detached from it all, like I was walking through a memory that wasn't mine. I passed people laughing in restaurants, kids pulling at their parents' hands, the rhythm of normal life beating steady and unaware. Inside me was a stillness that had nothing to do with peace. It was the stillness that comes after you set something irreversible into motion. I knew they would come looking for me, not out of love, but to reclaim control. They would want to rewrite the story again, to paint me as ungrateful, vindictive, unstable. But this time they had no canvas to paint on. The truth had already left my hands. It had taken form in documents, in reports, in records that could not be burned away by gossip. My name was no longer a whisper at the edge of their comfort. It was a signature on paper that told a story they could not silence. The next day I woke to the sound of knocking on my door. It was sharp, urgent, and unrelenting. I didn't open it. I stood behind it and listened. I could tell by the rhythm who it was. One of my uncles, the loudest voice at that dinner table, the one who had looked away first when I entered the house that night. He knocked until his patience ran out. Then his footsteps faded down the hall. I knew he would call again. They always called when they lost power. Later, I saw posts online. Family names tangled in public threads, neighbors talking, old stories resurfacing. The truth spread like ink in water, slow but unstoppable. It wasn't sensational. It was factual. The record spoke plainly. The money that was supposed to help others had been redirected. The house they called theirs was legally mine. I hadn't shouted these things. I had simply let the truth stand naked. And now it was doing what truth does. It cut cleanly, leaving no space for lies to breathe. I should have felt triumph, but what I felt instead was a heavy kind of clarity. Their pain wasn't my victory. It was the price of their own choices finally coming due. I sat by the window again that evening, the same place where I had watched the snow weeks before, and I felt the echo of that night in the empty house. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't punishment. It was freedom. Then came the letters, real letters this time, not texts or calls. They arrived in thin envelopes, written in familiar hands. Some begged, some accused. Some tried to appeal to memories of better days. I read none of them fully. I let the paper pile up on my desk until it became a monument to everything I had once wanted from them: recognition, connection, understanding. And then one morning I gathered them all and burned them in a small metal bowl on my balcony. The smoke rose into the cold air, twisting into the pale sky. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like release. In the days that followed, the frantic noise of their reaction grew louder. People I hadn't heard from in years began to circle back, pretending concern. The family's image began to crack in public. I watched it all unfold with a strange detachment, like observing a storm from behind glass. I wasn't inside it anymore. I had already lived through my own storm and come out on the other side. One evening I returned to the house for the last time. It stood empty just as before, but now it belonged entirely to me, legally, physically, emotionally. I walked through each room, touching the walls as if to say goodbye to ghosts. The dining table was still there, the same one they had abandoned me beside. I ran my hand over its surface, feeling the faint scratches and marks from years of gatherings that had always been more about power than love. The house no longer held their laughter, their cruelty, or their judgment. It held only silence, and that silence was mine. I opened the same window I'd opened that night after they left, and the cold air rushed in again. This time it didn't sting. It felt clean. The curtains fluttered softly, and for a moment I could almost see the reflection of my younger self standing there. Hopeful, desperate, naive. I nodded to that version of me, the one who had wanted so badly to belong. That person had done everything they could. It was time to let them rest. When I left the house, I locked the door with a key that no one else had anymore. The click of the lock sounded final, but not cruel. It was the sound of a boundary being set, a line drawn between the person I had been and the one I had become. I walked down the steps, through the snow that was melting into thin patches of grass. The season was changing. As I reached my car, I turned once more to look at the house. The windows reflected the fading light, blank and calm. It looked smaller now, almost harmless. I understood then that what had felt like a curse had been a kind of brutal education. I had learned what silence could do, both as a weapon and as a refuge. I had learned that walking away is not always loss. It can be the beginning of finally standing on your own ground. I started the engine and drove away slowly, not rushing, not looking back again. The road ahead was quiet and wide. The sky, for the first time in years, looked open. The next weeks passed in a strange half-light, as if the season itself was pausing to watch what would happen. Winter had started to slip into a weak spring. Patches of grass showed through the melting snow, and the air carried a smell of thawing soil and wet wood. I moved through those days quietly, working small hours, eating simple food, answering almost no one. The noise was all coming from elsewhere now, from them. I began to hear pieces of their world crumbling through small headlines, through whispers carried by people who still tried to keep contact. A business they ran together was being audited. A charity account had been frozen. A cousin who once bragged about family honor was suddenly very silent online. The proof had spread in slow waves. touching every corner that had been built on the lie. I did not gloat. I only watched. The facts did what they were meant to do. They existed. Sometimes I caught myself waiting for guilt to return. I waited for that sting, that reflex to apologize even when I was right. It never came. Instead, there was a dull ache that felt almost like sympathy, but not quite. They had chosen their masks for so long that removing them must have hurt. I could imagine them sitting in their own houses, surrounded by the same quiet they had once given me, wondering how silence could weigh so much. Letters came again, this time through lawyers. I read them all. They were careful, measured, full of words like regret and misunderstanding. I saw what they were trying to build, a path back, not to peace, but to control. Each sentence reached for the same old rhythm. If I would only soften, if I would only recant, they could rewrite everything again. I placed each letter in a folder, not out of anger, but for record. Paper had started this, and paper would close it. The nights were hardest, not because of fear, but because quiet expands when the rest of the world sleeps. I would lie awake, hearing the small hum of my refrigerator and the wind against the window. I thought about how loneliness and freedom can sound the same. I had gained space, but space has echoes. Sometimes I filled it with slow walks through the city after midnight. I would pass people in lit rooms, entire lives framed in yellow squares, and feel a calm distance from all of it. I was alone by choice now, and that made the silence less sharp. One evening, I drove out of town and stopped at the edge of the frozen lake. The ice was thinning, breaking into mirrors that caught the fading light. The air smelled of iron and cold water. I stood there until the sun dropped behind the trees. That place reminded me of being young, of summers when the family still felt whole. Back then we had come here to fish, to laugh, to pretend the world was kind. Remembering those moments did not break me. It simply showed how far away that version of life had drifted. The love had been real, but it had always carried a shadow of fear. I had spent years trying to earn what should have been given freely. When I returned home, a thick envelope waited at my door. Inside were copies of news clippings, official notices, and a short statement from the lawyer confirming that the investigations had expanded beyond anything I had expected. The truth had gathered its own momentum. It no longer needed me to push. I sat on the couch with the envelope in my lap, feeling both heavy and light. I realized that justice, when it finally moves, is quieter than anyone imagines. It does not roar, it rearranges. The next morning brought another knock on my door, softer this time. Through the peephole I saw my aunt, the one who had always stood halfway between cruelty and care. Her hair was gray now. Her eyes looked hollow. She waited for a long moment, then slipped a small note under the door and walked away. I picked it up only after her footsteps disappeared. The paper held just one line written in uneven handwriting. We didn't know it would go this far. I read it several times, then placed it beside the burned letters. They had known enough. They had known that their silence protected lies. They had known that turning away that night at the table was an act of violence dressed as unity. The note was not an apology. It was fear written small. Still, I did not hate her for it. Fear had ruled all of them, and now it was turning inward. Days blurred. The story kept spreading. I stopped checking the news. Instead, I spent time cleaning my apartment, giving shape to ordinary things. I scrubbed the kitchen floor, sorted papers, opened the windows to let in cold light. The scent of lemon cleaner mixed with the air and made everything smell temporary, as if the space was waiting to be remade. Every movement felt like reclaiming a piece of normal life that had been buried under years of tension. One afternoon, I received a letter from the legal office confirming the final settlement. The property and its connected assets were now fully under my name. The accounts that had been hidden were opened for review. The investigation into the misuse of funds would continue without my involvement. I read the letter twice. It was written in the dry, impersonal tone of bureaucracy, but between those flat sentences I could hear the end of a long echo. The world was closing the file. I placed the letter on the table and stared at it for a while. The fight that had defined so much of my existence had finished. There would be no big curtain fall, no cinematic ending, just this paper and the quiet that followed. The family that once filled every part of my identity now existed only as names in official documents and memories that had lost their color. That night I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights flicker below. Each window, each car moving down the street, felt distant and alive in a way I couldn't fully join yet. But there was no sadness. There was only stillness, the kind that arrives when all storms have burned themselves out. My hands rested on the railing. The cold metal steadied me. Somewhere inside the silence I could hear my own breath, slow and even. I had wanted so long for their voices to fill the void. Now I understood the void was the space I needed to grow. The phone vibrated once more, a single message notification lighting the dark. I didn't read it. I deleted it without opening it. The glow of the screen faded, leaving only the night and the hum of distant traffic. In that small moment, I felt something close to peace, not the warm kind that brings joy, but the solid kind that holds its ground. The frantic noise of their world could keep spinning, but I had stepped outside its orbit. Their panic no longer reached me. I was on the far edge of it all, quiet, intact, awake. Days later, the quiet became almost tender. It filled my apartment like slow sunlight through dust. I could finally hear small things again. The creak of the floorboards, the steady rhythm of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator. None of it demanded anything from me. I had spent years living under noise, under judgment disguised as family. Now the only sound was my own breathing, and it felt like permission. I started to walk each morning before work. The streets were still damp from melting snow, and the smell of cold earth rose from the ground. I liked the way light collected in puddles and how the sky looked wider than it had all winter. Movement helped me remember that life does not stop just because grief takes a different shape. My grief had turned quiet. It no longer tore. It hummed. News of my family's collapse reached me in fragments. The house, the same one where they had turned away from me, was listed for sale. Some of them had moved away. Others were still trying to repair what had been lost. I read those updates without reaction. The world had already given its judgment, not because I demanded it, but because truth is slow and patient. It arrives when it chooses, and it never knocks twice. I returned to Michigan once more that spring. I did not tell anyone. I drove the long highway until I reached the small town near the lake. The air smelled of wet pine and distant rain. When I reached the old family house, I parked on the same gravel path where I had once stood with trembling hands. The for sale sign leaned slightly to one side. Grass had grown tall around it. I stood there a long time watching wind move through the empty yard. It did not hurt anymore. The pain had burned itself clean. I walked around the house once, tracing the perimeter like someone closing a circle. Through the window I could see the faint outline of the dining table, now covered in dust sheets, the same table where they had left me sitting alone. I felt no urge to enter. The door belonged to the past, and the past was sealed. I touched the cold wood of the porch rail and whispered goodbye inside my mind. It was not forgiveness, and it was not anger. It was simply the end. Driving away, I took the back roads through fields still damp with rain. The clouds hung low, heavy but bright around the edges. I thought about everything that had led here. The moment I walked into that house, believing in reconciliation, the silence that met me, the sudden exodus of every face I had loved, that memory would never vanish. It would stay as a single, sharp image. People rising from a table, the sound of chairs scraping, the air turning hollow, but now it carried no weight. It was only a photograph in my head, faded at the corners. At night I stopped by the lake again. The ice was gone. Water moved gently against the rocks. The moon floated low and wide, scattering silver light across the surface. I sat on the shore and listened. The sound was small, steady, endless. In that rhythm I found something like understanding, that love can be real even when it dies, that truth can hurt and heal at the same time, that survival sometimes means walking away while the world calls you cruel. When I finally stood, my legs felt steady. The future was blank, but blankness no longer frightened me. It was a clean page. I drove back toward the highway with the window open, letting cold air fill the car. The smell of lake water and pines stayed with me for miles. Back home, life became ordinary again. Work, meals, laundry, quiet evenings. People who knew nothing of the story treated me as if I had always been whole. I let them. The drama belonged to another lifetime. I had learned that healing is not a single event, but a slow rearranging of small moments. Washing dishes, opening curtains, buying fruit at a market. Each act was a sentence in a new story I was writing without even meaning to. Sometimes I still wake before dawn and feel the old ache move under my ribs, but it fades quickly. I remind myself that the ache is proof of feeling, not failure. The world is full of families like mine, built on the fragile hope that silence can keep peace. But silence, when used as punishment, only breeds ghosts. I am done living with ghosts. One evening, as the sky turned red over the rooftops, I sat by my window and thought about Thanksgiving. That day no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the truth of what happened, the leaving, the breaking, and the standing alone. If anyone ever asked, I would say that it was the day my family showed me who they were, and the day I learned who I could be without them. I am not angry now. I am awake. There is power in seeing the full picture, even when it hurts. The people who left me at that table taught me something they never meant to teach, that love without honesty is only performance. I don't need their approval anymore. I don't need their house or their history. I only need the space to breathe without fear. The world outside my window is quiet tonight. The streetlights hum. A dog barks somewhere far away. The sound fades into stillness, and I realize that silence is no longer my enemy. It is my witness. It heard everything and kept it safe until I was ready to listen. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to return to that Thanksgiving after everything that had happened, to use the house that night as the line between truth and cruelty, and to let their rejection end what I could never fix. Because that decision did not only cost me a family name, it ended years of quiet submission, exposed the greed that hid beneath love, and left a silence so complete that even now when I breathe, it feels like the first breath I have ever taken. And I know none of them will be inviting me to their next Thanksgiving dinner this year.